Have you ever believed in justice only to have the system turn against you? Paul, a judge who inherited the mantle of justice, never imagined that one day he would be the one wronged. One seemingly ordinary night, a luxury car, and a false accusation. Everything changed forever. Don't miss the next stories. The city's sky had already fallen into darkness when Paul Gaines left the courthouse after a long day of trials. He was accustomed to the tension of cases, the lies in testimonies, the sharp arguments from both sides. But he never thought that one day he would be the one to face injustice on his way home. The Mercedes cruised through the empty streets of Birmingham, streetlights reflecting off the car windows, creating long streaks of light, like dragging his weary thoughts along with him. Another workday had ended, but little did he know, a real nightmare was just beginning. When he stopped at a traffic light, the red and blue lights suddenly flashed in the rearview mirror, reflecting the powerful presence of the police. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't run a red light, hadn't sped, hadn't violated any laws. But in that moment, he understood. He knew that feeling all too well. The feeling of being pulled over, not because of any violation, but simply because a black man was sitting behind the wheel of an expensive car. The knock on the window pulled him back to reality. Paul rolled down the window, meeting the cold gaze of Officer Hannah Doyle, a tough woman with her hair tied back, her face showing no emotion except suspicion. "License and registration," she said, without any explanation. Paul kept his composure, carefully reaching for his documents, knowing that any sudden movement could lead to dire consequences. He handed them over, hoping this was just a small misunderstanding. But Doyle's gaze didn't leave him. It wasn't to confirm his identity, but as if she was waiting for something. Then she keyed her radio, requesting backup. Paul held his breath. A wave of helplessness washed over him. He had spent his entire life upholding the law, believing in justice, but now the very system he had protected was turning against him, all because of the color of his skin. He wanted to believe this could be resolved quickly, that when the backup arrived, they would check the registration and realize the mistake. But when the second patrol car arrived, with a young officer who looked excited, Paul understood that this was not just a simple misunderstanding. Officer Patrick Harris stepped out, his hand hovering near his belt, ready for action. Doyle turned to him and said firmly, "It could be a stolen vehicle." Paul opened his mouth to object, but a simmering anger held him back. No evidence, no reason, just a cold assumption. The words sliced through his mind. It could be a stolen vehicle. He swallowed the anger rising in his throat and kept his voice as calm as he could. "Officer, I'm Judge Paul Gaines. This car is registered to me. The papers are right here in your hands." Doyle didn't blink. "Step out of the vehicle." A wave of fear rushed over him, but not for himself. He had seen these stories too many times. Innocent men being dragged from their cars, handcuffed, charged without cause. And he knew that if he wasn't careful, he would just become another statistic. But he couldn't back down. If he stepped back, if he stayed silent, this would continue, not just with him, but with thousands of others who didn't have the title of judge to protect them. "I've been cooperative," he said slowly. "I've provided the documents. I'm not resisting." "Step outside. Office the vehicle," Doyle repeated, her voice now more rigid. Paul took a deep breath, knowing he had no choice left. He slowly opened the door and stepped out. As soon as his feet hit the ground, Doyle immediately grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. The sharp pain wasn't physical, it was the sting of humiliation. Officer Patrick stood nearby, watching him as if waiting for a reaction. All it would take was a flinch, just a small resistance, and they would have a reason to do something worse. He couldn't give them that reason. He lifted his head and looked Doyle straight in the eyes. "What am I being arrested for?" She didn't answer. He turned to Harris. "What's the reason?" He remained silent. None of them had a reasonable answer. Because there was no reason. In that moment, Paul realized that justice did not exist here, at least not for people like him. But that didn't mean he would stay silent, and that moment changed everything. The second patrol car arrived, its red and blue lights reflecting off Paul Gaines' car windows, casting flickering shadows on the road. His heart raced, not from fear but from the suppressed anger. His entire life had been spent believing in justice, in fairness, in a system he had dedicated years to protecting. But right now, standing in the dark street with his wrist tightly gripped by Officer Hannah Doyle, he realized that justice could be a luxury when the color of your skin is enough to make you suspect. Doyle didn't let go, even though she had the proper paperwork in her hand. His car wasn't stolen, but that didn't matter. What they saw wasn't a man of stature, not a judge, but simply a black man in an expensive car. "This doesn't need to go this far," Paul said, trying to keep his composure. He knew that if he reacted even slightly wrong, they would use it to escalate things. He had seen this too many times, on the news, in courtrooms, and now he was living in that nightmare. But Doyle didn't care about logic or the truth. "Step back," she ordered, still holding on to him. "I'm conducting an investigation." "Investigation into what?" "I've shown you my papers. I am the legal owner of this vehicle. You can say whatever you want, but I'm deciding this isn't ending here." Paul swallowed his anger. At that moment, Officer Patrick Harris moved closer, his hand nearly brushing against his gun belt. His eyes said it all. If Paul made any sudden move, even just a slight reaction, they'd have a reason to cuff him. He knew that this system didn't operate on truth. It ran on power, and right now, power wasn't on his side. A new voice cut through the tension, deep and steady. "What's going on here?" They all turned. A new officer had arrived, Sergeant Aaron Ramirez. He stepped out of the patrol car, his sharp eyes scanning the scene like a knife cutting through the night. He wasn't in a hurry, but there was a cautiousness in the way he observed. Not just Paul, but he was also looking directly at Doyle. "What's the issue, Officer Doyle?" Ramirez asked, his voice calm but firm. Doyle clenched her jaw, as if trying to figure out how to control the situation. "I have reason to believe this vehicle might be stolen." "Have you checked the paperwork?" Ramirez asked. A heavy silence fell. Doyle didn't respond immediately. Ramirez took a breath, then reached for his radio. "I need to check the license plate of a black Mercedes, registered under the name Paul Gaines." Seconds later, the voice from the radio crackled through. "Vehicle is legal. No stolen reports." The answer hit the tense air like a sharp blow. Ramirez turned back to Doyle, his patience now gone. "Officer Doyle, you had this information from the start, didn't you?" Doyle tightened her grip. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't speak, but her silence was an answer in itself. Paul looked at her, half expecting an apology, but he knew it wasn't coming. There was no remorse in her eyes, only disappointment that her plan hadn't gone the way she wanted. Ramirez sighed, then turned to Paul. "Mr. Gaines, I apologize for the inconvenience." "Apologize?" Paul scoffed. "Apologize for what, Sergeant? For detaining me on the road without cause? For treating me like a criminal just because I'm driving an expensive car? Or for making me prove I'm not a thief when I've never committed a crime in my life?" The silence grew heavier than ever. Ramirez knew he didn't have a perfect answer. He wasn't Doyle. He wasn't Harris. He wasn't the one who caused this issue, but he was part of the system that allowed it to continue. And Paul knew that an apology wouldn't change a thing, but that didn't mean he was going to let it slide. "I want to file a complaint," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "Officer Doyle abused her power. She not only stopped my car without cause, but also refused to verify the information when I had already provided the proper documents." Hannah Doyle spun to face him, her eyes flashing with anger. "Are you serious?" Paul stared directly into her eyes, completely serious. Ramirez nodded, not opposing. He knew this time the system would have to answer for itself. But what scared Paul the most wasn't what happened tonight. It was the thought that, if he weren't a judge, if he were just an ordinary man on his way home, would he still be standing here, demanding justice for himself? The silence in the small space of the patrol car became suffocating as Paul Gaines sat there, his hands cuffed in front of him, eyes staring out the window. The streetlights flashed quickly by, casting shadows across his face, the face of a man who had dedicated his career to upholding justice, yet now found himself on the wrong side of the law. He wasn't a criminal, had never been one, but that didn't mean he wasn't being treated like one simply because of how he looked. Anger surged within him, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew that if he lost control, they would use it as an excuse to escalate things. Hannah Doyle was still driving, her face showing no hint of remorse, only stiffness and stubbornness. She was wrong, but she would never admit it. "What are you thinking, Judge?" Her voice cut through the silence, cold and emotionless. "That you're going to win this case?" Paul turned to face her, keeping his voice steady. "I don't need to win, Doyle. I just need the truth." Doyle smirked. "The truth? Do you really think this system cares about the truth?" Her words left Paul silent for a moment. It was what he had fought against his entire life, a system that some people like Doyle believed only served those with power, while others were crushed beneath its wheels. The car stopped in front of the police station. The door opened, and Patrick Harris stepped forward, pulling Paul out of the car with unnecessary force. "Be careful, Judge. Here, you're just a regular man." He had understood that from the very first moment. They led him inside, the flickering fluorescent lights shining on his face as he passed the rows of desks. A few officers glanced at him, some recognizing him, others indifferent. "Record and take him to holding," Doyle ordered. "We'll see if anyone comes to bail him out tomorrow morning." Paul stared at her, not blinking. "You really want to take this as far as it'll go?" Doyle didn't answer, but her expression said it all. They took his fingerprints, snapped his mugshot, and recorded his information. Paul felt the insult in every procedure, being treated like a person with no rights at all. But he didn't argue. "Who would you like to call?" an officer asked, his hand resting on the phone. Paul leaned back in his chair, a slight smile curling on his lips. "Elizabeth Gaines," he said, still staring directly at Doyle. Doyle's fist clenched tightly. They hadn't expected that. They didn't know he wasn't just an ordinary man. They didn't know they had just crossed paths with the wrong person. Elizabeth Gaines, his wife, wasn't just any woman. She was one of the most powerful lawyers in the state, someone who had fought and won numerous human rights cases. And when she received this call, the real storm was just beginning. Paul Gaines sat in the holding cell, the space cramped and cold. The old gray walls, the dim light from the fluorescent bulb, the mix of old paint and sweat filled the air. He had seen rooms like this hundreds of times in his career, but never from this perspective. A judge detained like a criminal, a bitter farce of the system he once trusted. The metal door opened and a young officer stepped in. "Come on, Gaines. Someone's here to bail you out." His voice held a hint of hesitation. Whether they liked it or not, Everyone knew Paul Gaines wasn't just any ordinary criminal. Paul stood up, his back straight, eyes unwavering. He wasn't surprised to see Elizabeth Gaines waiting outside. The woman carried a natural authority without needing to utter a word. She wore a dark suit, her hair neatly pulled back, and her sharp eyes swept across everyone in the room as if they were just pawns in a game she had already planned. "Are you okay?" Elizabeth asked, her voice low but with genuine concern. Paul nodded, though a bitter knot formed inside him. "I'm fine, but this can't be left alone." Elizabeth took a deep breath, her gaze turning cold as it landed on Hannah Doyle, who stood at the front desk, arms crossed, as if she were still in control of the situation. "I want all the documents related to this arrest," Elizabeth said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Now," Doyle sneered. "I'm just following procedure." Elizabeth didn't care for that excuse. "I'll let the court decide if this is a legal procedure or not." The atmosphere in the room suddenly became heavier. Paul looked around, noticing the confused stares of the other officers. They knew things had gone too far. This was no longer just a routine traffic stop. This was an abuse of power, and now it was being exposed. Aaron Ramirez, the senior sergeant, walked in, his gaze briefly passing over Doyle before settling on Paul and Elizabeth. "I apologize for this, Judge Gaines," he said, his tone more sincere than anyone else in the station. "We'll be reviewing the entire situation." Paul studied the man, trying to determine whether he truly intended to do the right thing. He had been a judge long enough to know that an apology meant nothing without action to back it up. "I'll need to see that," Paul replied, his gaze steady. "And I won't let this go." Elizabeth placed her hand on her husband's, a gesture of both comfort and determination. "We won't let it go." Doyle stood there, her lips tightly pressed, but now she had lost control of the situation. The people she had once thought of as weak were now the ones turning the tables. As Paul stepped out of the station, taking a deep breath under the quiet night sky, he realized that this fight had only just begun. But this time he wasn't alone, and that gave him hope, that the truth in the end would speak for itself. Paul Gaines sat quietly in his office, his eyes fixed on the stack of papers in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. The events of the previous night were still deeply etched in his mind. The flashing lights in the rearview mirror, Hannah Doyle's cold tone, the helplessness of being accused solely because of the color of his skin. He had seen too many people fall into such situations, but he never imagined he would one day become a victim himself. A knock on the door broke his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. Elizabeth entered, carrying a file and a stern look on her face. "Paul, we have work to do," she said, placing the folder in front of him. "We can't let this be buried." He sighed, flipping through the pages. The official complaint, the arrest report, a list of Doyle's previous cases. It was all there, a clear picture of a pattern of abuse of power that had persisted for far too long. He looked up at Elizabeth, seeing the determination in her eyes, a determination he felt within himself as well. "Do you think they'll actually take this seriously?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. She placed her hand on his shoulder, her expression softening. "If we do nothing, they certainly won't. But if you speak up, if you use your position to apply pressure, they won't be able to ignore it." Her words left Paul silent. He had spent his whole life believing in the justice system, but now he realized that system only worked when people made it do the right thing. That afternoon, Paul and Elizabeth went to the police station. As they walked in, the eyes of the officers followed them with noticeable tension. Word had spread. They were no longer just waiting for justice, they were demanding it. Aaron Ramirez was waiting for them in his office, his face unable to hide the worry. "Judge Gaines, I know why you're here," he said, his voice calm but weighted. "I've reviewed the reports, and honestly, what I see is unacceptable." Paul looked at him, waiting. Ramirez continued, "We are opening an internal investigation. Hannah Doyle will be suspended while we conduct a thorough review of her actions." Surprise flickered in Paul's eyes. He had expected resistance, but instead, it seemed there was a genuine shift happening. "And I need you to testify," Ramirez added. "You may be just one case, but I believe you're not the first." A rush of emotion swept over Paul: regret for what had happened, anger for the injustice he and others had endured, but more importantly, hope. If he could do something to change this, this was the time. He nodded slowly. "I will." Elizabeth gently squeezed his hand, a silent but powerful connection. This time, they weren't just fighting for Paul Gaines. They were fighting for all those who had never had the chance to speak out. He was accustomed to the formal courtrooms, where every word he spoke could decide the fate of a person. But now, he was the one waiting for judgment. Not in a legal sense, he wasn't being charged, but in terms of honor, the justice he had spent his life pursuing. Aaron Ramirez walked in, his face tense, but betraying a hint of sympathy. He placed a file on the table, sat across from Paul, and took a deep breath. "We've investigated Officer Hannah Doyle," Ramirez began, his voice calm but carrying weight. "And you were right, Paul. She wasn't just targeting you. She has a long history of making unwarranted traffic stops, especially with people of color." Paul didn't seem surprised. He had known this. He felt the anger simmering inside him, but he didn't let it surface. Instead, he listened. "We've found more than 12 reports from other victims, people who were stopped without cause, humiliated, and abused. Some filed complaints, but all were dismissed or forgotten." Ramirez flipped through a few pages of the file and shook his head. "No one had enough standing to hold her accountable until you came along." Paul stared at the file. 12 people, 12 lives affected by senseless prejudice, by a system that was supposed to protect them. "What can be done?" Paul asked, his voice low but resolute. Ramirez sighed, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. "I can suspend Doyle immediately, but without external pressure, she'll just be reassigned to another area and continue these actions." Paul understood. The system didn't change easily over one incident, but if he spoke out, if he used his reputation and position to stir public attention, things could be different. "I'll take this public," Paul said, his eyes gleaming with determination. "I won't let it be buried like all the times before." Ramirez stared at him for a few seconds, then nodded slowly. "You know that could make you a target, right?" Paul smirked. "I became a target the moment I stepped out of that car last night." Silence enveloped the room for a moment, but it wasn't the silence of despair. It was the silence of a decision made, of a battle about to begin. When Paul left the police station, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not just for himself, but for all those who had been bullied, who had been abused with no one standing up for them. They wouldn't stay silent anymore. The dim light reflected off the surface of the old wooden desk. Paul had spent his entire life fighting for justice, but now he was facing a bitter truth. The system he once trusted was far from perfect. It had flaws, and one of those flaws had swallowed him whole in just one night. The phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. "We know what you're doing. Stop before it's too late." Paul furrowed his brow, his chest heavy. He knew this wouldn't be easy. When someone like him stood up against the wrongs within the system, there were always those trying to silence him, but that didn't scare him. If anything, it made him more resolute. He called Ramirez. After just a few rings, the sergeant's tense voice came through. "Paul, I just got a call from my superiors. They're ordering me to stop the investigation into Doyle." Paul gripped the phone tightly. "Why?" "They didn't say, but I know someone's pulling the strings. Doyle has connections we don't know about." Silence hung in the air. Paul stared out the window, watching the blinking lights of cars moving through the night. He knew he could step back, let everything fade into obscurity like so many times before. But if he did, he would betray the very ideals he had spent his life upholding. "I'm not stopping," he said firmly. "They can threaten me, but I'm not easily intimidated." Ramirez sighed. "Neither am I. I've seen too many like Doyle abuse their power without consequence, but we need stronger evidence." Paul paused for a moment, then remembered the files Ramirez had shown him. 12 people had been abused by Doyle's power. If someone was willing to speak out, they could bring down the very system that protected her. "I'll talk to the victims," Paul said. "We'll bring the truth to light." When he hung up, a strange feeling filled him, not just anger, but hope. Hope that this time, justice would prevail. He had spent his entire life fighting for justice, but now the very system he once trusted had turned its back on him. They wanted him to be silent. They wanted him to step back. But he knew if he didn't continue, who would stand up? The phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen, an unknown number. Hesitating for a moment, Paul answered. "Judge Gaines?" The voice was deep, yet there was a slight tremor. "Yes, who's speaking?" "This is Jonathan Wells. I was wrongfully arrested by Hannah Doyle." Paul froze. He recognized the name. Jonathan had been accused of assaulting a police officer, but the evidence was unclear. At the time, Paul had suspected something wasn't right, but no one was willing to investigate further. Now, Jonathan was calling him. "I need to meet you," Jonathan continued. "I have something you need." Paul's heart raced in his chest. This could be the turning point in the fight against Hannah Doyle. "Meet me at Cafe Number 5 on Jefferson Street, 1 hour. He hung up and immediately called Ramirez. "Ramirez, I've got a witness," Paul said quickly. "He might have evidence of Doyle's misconduct." Ramirez was silent for a moment. "Are you sure this isn't a trap?" "I don't know, but I have to go. I'll come with you." An hour later, Paul and Ramirez entered the cafe. The air was filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the scent of pastries. In the corner of the room, a young man with anxious eyes was sitting, his hands clenched tightly together. Paul walked over and pulled up a chair. "Jonathan Wells?" Jonathan nodded, his eyes wary. "I know I might be in danger for saying this," Jonathan whispered, "but I can't stay silent anymore. I have a recording. That night, Doyle staged everything. She wanted me to be an example, to intimidate others." Paul looked at Jonathan, empathy rising in his chest. How many people like Jonathan had been buried in silence? How many had been crushed by this system simply because they had no voice? Jonathan pulled out his phone and opened an audio file. A voice echoed, cold and arrogant. "I don't care if you did it or not. I just need a name to close the file." It was Hannah Doyle's voice. Paul clenched his fist. This was what they needed. This was the moment that could change everything. "Jonathan," he said slowly, "thank you. But be prepared. When this truth comes to light, we're going to face a real battle." Jonathan looked up at him, fear mixed with hope in his eyes. "As long as I don't have to run anymore, I'm ready." Ramirez placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder, as if making a silent promise. "Then let's get started." Paul Gaines sat at his desk, the dim light from the lamp casting faint shadows across his face. He stared at the computer screen where the recording of Hannah Doyle's confession was playing. Each time he listened, a simmering anger flared up within him. Each word, each sentence came through cold and indifferent. I don't care whether you did it or not. I just need a name to close the file. A lifetime as a judge had exposed Paul to countless miscarriages of justice, but he had never faced such a bitter truth. He too could become a victim of this system. He clenched his fist. He knew he couldn't remain silent, but justice wasn't just about anger. It required strategy, preparation. The knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Ramirez stepped in, his face serious. "We have a problem," he said tersely. Paul frowned. "What is it?" "Jonathan Wells is missing." The room seemed to freeze. Paul stood up abruptly. "What did you say?" Ramirez sighed, pulling up a chair and sitting down. "I just tried to contact him. His phone's off. The neighbors said he left about an hour ago. No one's seen him return." A cold shiver ran down Paul's spine. This wasn't a coincidence. "Doyle?" Ramirez nodded. "It has to be her. She knows Jonathan has evidence." Paul bit his lip. A sense of helplessness crept into his thoughts. Jonathan was their only witness. If he was gone, "We need to find him." Ramirez looked at him, worry in his eyes. "Do you think we have enough time?" Paul gazed out the window. Outside, the city was engulfed in darkness, with streetlights flickering in the night. "We don't have a choice." Never before had he felt so powerless, but never before had he felt his fighting spirit burn so fiercely. Jonathan could be in danger, but if they didn't fight, if they didn't bring the truth to light, how many more people like Jonathan would be buried in the shadows of this system? Paul turned back, his gaze steely. "Call everyone who can help. We won't let Doyle win." His head felt heavy, his eyes fixed on the stack of documents in front of him, an official indictment for Hannah Doyle. Finally, after days of struggle, the truth had come to light. But there was something inside him that wasn't at peace. In the hallway, Ramirez leaned against the wall, his hands tucked in the pockets of his jacket. When he saw Paul walk out, he raised an eyebrow. "Are you okay?" Paul nodded, but both of them knew it was a lie. They had done the right thing, but the cost had been too high. Jonathan Wells, the only one brave enough to testify against Doyle, was still missing. The team was out searching for him, but there was no news. Paul sighed, a heavy sense of regret weighing on his chest. He had promised to protect that kid. Ramirez gently patted him on the shoulder. "We'll find him." Paul closed his eyes for a moment, trying to suppress the negative thoughts that flooded his mind. They had come too far to turn back now. As he prepared to leave, the office door suddenly swung open. A police officer rushed in, panting heavily. "They found him." Paul's heart sank. "How is he?" The officer hesitated for a moment. "He's injured, but he's alive." Those words hit him like a cold wave. Paul and Ramirez rushed out of the office, ignoring the curious glances around them. When they reached the hospital, Jonathan was lying in bed, visible bruises on his pale face. His eyes opened, weak but aware. When he saw Paul, he managed a faint smile. "Judge Gaines, I kept my promise." Paul felt his eyes well up. He sat by the bed, grasping Jonathan's cold hand. "You did well, Jonathan. We've won." A tear rolled down the boy's cheek, not from pain, but from knowing that this fight had finally meant something. Outside the window, the first light of dawn began to break, dispelling the darkness of a long night. The truth had been restored to its rightful place, and this time, justice was not forgotten. Paul Gaines' story was not just a personal battle against injustice, but a profound reminder of the true nature of justice. It showed that even those who place absolute trust in the legal system can become victims of that very system. Prejudice, power, and abuse can exist anywhere. But the most important thing is not how they exist, but how we face them. Paul could have stayed silent. He could have turned away and let everything slip by like so many others. But he chose to stand up, no matter the consequences. That decision not only protected his own honor, but also opened up opportunities for others, those without a voice, without power, and with no one to stand up for them. The truth can be distorted, but it can never be buried forever. The fight for justice is never easy, but if no one dares to stand up, the abusers will never be punished. We don't just need the law, we need people with enough courage to force the law to serve its true purpose. Therefore, the most important lesson from this story is, don't stay silent in the face of injustice. Speak out, take action, and protect the truth. Because if you don't, tomorrow it might be you who becomes the victim. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.